He was born into a world half tamed and half wild, where the forests of Kentucky still whispered the stories of Daniel Boone, and the frontier crept westward like a great wave, swallowing forests, mountains, and men. In 1809, in the cradle of this dangerous new world, Christopher Houston Carson opened his eyes. Not yet a legend, not yet a myth, but destined to become both. He was born in Madison County, the 9th of 15 children in a world that did not wait for the weak. By the time young Kit could walk, he was already learning how to survive. His father, Lindsey Carson, died when Kit was just 9 years old, leaving the boy to grow up in the long shadow of hardship. But hardship would become his forge. At age 14, Kit was bound into an apprenticeship with a saddle maker in Franklin, Missouri, a trade respectable and steady, but one that pressed his soul into too small a box. He hammered and stitched for 3 long years, listening every day to the voices of trappers and traders who came through the shop, covered in dust and legend. They spoke of mountains that scraped the sky, of rivers that ran cold and wild, of buffalo herds blackening the prairie, and of nights under stars so wide they made you believe in God or forget him altogether. And so one night, without fanfare or farewell, Kit Carson ran away. He left behind the anvil and the awl, the safety of apprenticeship, the comfort of routine, and rode west into the unknown. It was not rebellion that drove him, but destiny. He joined a caravan heading down the Santa Fe Trail, one of the most dangerous trade routes in North America. It was lined with hostile Comanche territory, unforgiving desert, and endless uncertainty. But none of that deterred the 16-year-old runaway. He signed on as a cook, a cleaner, anything to keep moving west. By the time the caravan reached Santa Fe, Kit was already learning Spanish, trading with Mexicans, and catching the eyes of hardened men twice his age. They saw something in the boy, a silence that wasn't fear, a calmness that wasn't weakness. In the wild places of the American West, Kit Carson became a man faster than most boys live to be. Over the next decade, Carson transformed himself from runaway apprentice to seasoned mountain man, learning the ways of the land like a second language. He trapped beaver in the snow-choked canyons of the Rockies, hunted elk along the Green River, and crossed the Great Divide more times than most men crossed a street. He lived alongside the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Shoshone, adopting their customs, learning their languages, and earning their respect. He was not merely passing through the West, he was being claimed by it. He rode with Ewing Young, traded with Taos merchants, and joined famous trapping expeditions that vanished into the wilderness for months, sometimes years. There were winters spent buried in snow, summers chasing shadows across desert sands, and nights where the only comfort was the crackling fire and the promise of another sunrise. Kit Carson's reputation grew not through boasting, but through whispers. Stories passed from campfire to campfire, from one frostbitten tent to another. He was quiet, deadly when provoked, loyal to a fault, and possessed a sense of direction that bordered on supernatural. They said he could smell a storm before the clouds formed, that he could read the ground like a book, that he once walked barefoot through snow for days to rescue a wounded companion. Every story stretched the truth, and yet none of them were untrue. His name echoed across the Rocky Mountains, through the canyons of New Mexico, and across the arid plains of Arizona. But it wasn't until dime novelists got hold of it that Kit Carson truly became a legend. Back east in parlors and schoolrooms, Carson's name appeared in cheap paperbacks, his face imagined in dramatic sketches, larger than life, more myth than man. They wrote of him slaying grizzlies with bowie knives, rescuing maidens from marauding bands of Apache, outdrawing entire posses of outlaws with twin revolvers. Much of it was fantasy, embroidered by authors who had never set foot beyond St. Louis. But the man at the center of the myth remained real, and Kit Carson never read a word of it. He was illiterate, a man who signed his name with an X, but he knew what he was becoming, a symbol. To those in the East he was the American David, fearless, cunning, blessed by Providence. To native tribes, he was both respected and feared, a man who could speak with them as a brother one day and ride against them the next. To soldiers, scouts, and settlers, he was a compass, a steady hand in a spinning world. But to himself, he was just Kit, a man who had chosen the long trail, the hard trail, a man who believed that the land had no masters, only students. That courage wasn't loud, it was silent, cold, and persistent. That loyalty was worth more than bullets, and that a man's word once given should ride with him to the grave. By the time the United States began to eye the vast territories of the West with conquest in mind, Kit Carson had already been there. He had mapped it in his mind, in his scars, and in the blood of those who tried to stop him. He was no longer a boy who ran from a saddle shop. He was a frontier legend, riding in the space between myth and man, his story still just beginning. And the West, vast, violent, unbroken, was waiting for him. The summer sun shimmered above the wild valleys of Wyoming in 1835, casting golden light across the sage-covered hills where smoke curled into the sky. It was the season of the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, and the Green River Basin thrummed with life, color, and the low roar of many tongues. Traders, trappers, mountain men, fur company agents, and warriors from half a dozen tribes converged on the high plain to barter, to celebrate, to drink, to fight, to sing. It was the West's most famous meeting of wilderness and commerce, and Kit Carson was in the thick of it. He arrived in dusty buckskins, his eyes narrow against the wind, his rifle slung casually across his back. Though still young, Carson already carried the look of a man weathered by frost and fire, skin tanned like rawhide movements, quiet and calculated, the kind of man who could disappear into the timber and not be seen for months. He'd trapped the headwaters of the Missouri, survived the mountain winters, and sat beside Arapaho fires under the stars. But it was here, in this chaotic dance of trade and tension, that Carson's legend would ignite in blood. Among the revelers was Joseph Chouinard, a loud and imposing French-Canadian fur trapper with a mouth as wild as his temper. Tall and broad-shouldered, Chouinard had a reputation for hard drinking, harder living, and a tongue sharpened by whiskey. He moved from tent to tent, boasting of his conquests, mocking rival trappers, insulting native tribes, and gambling until his fingers trembled. On the second night of the gathering, after too many cups of corn whiskey and a handful of bad bets, he turned his sneering attention to Singing Grass, a serene, intelligent Arapaho woman who had become Carson's companion. Her quiet grace was a stark contrast to the raucous chaos around her. She was neither loud nor flashy, but her presence silenced conversations when she passed. Carson respected her deeply, perhaps even loved her, though words like that came hard to men who slept in blizzards. And when Chouinard mocked her in a drunken slur, calling her a blanket squaw, and laughing at Carson for keeping animal company, something inside Kit Carson broke loose. The camp fell still. Carson didn't shout, he didn't roar, he simply stepped forward, eyes locked on the Frenchman, and in a voice quiet and cold as river ice said, "You'll answer for that, Chouinard, at dawn." The next morning, as the early light spilled like fire over the distant peaks, two men faced one another on horseback, pistols in hand. The air was razor-thin with tension. Warriors stood alongside traders, all silent. This wasn't just a duel, it was a reckoning. The West held its breath. The horses twitched. The signal came. Two pistol shots shattered the morning calm, and Chouinard's wrist exploded in a mist of red. He dropped his weapon, crying out, the bone shattered, his hand useless. Carson sat motionless in the saddle, smoke curling from his barrel, eyes still calm like nothing had happened. He holstered his pistol, turned, and rode away. No one laughed at Kit Carson again. His name, already murmured in taverns and trading posts, was now spoken with reverence. The boy from Kentucky had become the man the wilderness respected and feared. But it wasn't violence that defined Carson's life. It was a quieter truth, one carved by years spent not just in the wild, but among the people who called it home. While others sought to conquer the West, Carson lived in it, with it, even for it. He moved between worlds, white and native, like a ghost in moccasins, unseen until needed. He lived with the Arapaho, traded with the Cheyenne, hunted beside the Delaware, and knew their languages better than he knew his own. Where other trappers saw enemies, Carson saw nations, cultures, and people. He shared fires, broke bread, listened to the stories of elders. He wasn't a man pretending how, He was accepted. Among the Arapaho, he was given the name Little Chief, not for power, but for the quiet influence he carried. He married women from these tribes, not for alliances, but for love, or as close to it as a mountain man could give. With Singing Grass, he found something approaching peace. She bore him children. They laughed in the long summer evenings and watched the rivers swell with snowmelt. She understood the silence that followed him, the grief he never spoke. But the wilderness gives nothing without taking more. Singing Grass fell ill, her breath growing shallow, her strength draining. There were no doctors in the high country, only herbs and prayers. Carson tried everything. He left traps empty, seeking medicine men. He rode through the night for water. He held her hand as she faded, and when she passed, the wild places they had loved together suddenly felt colder. He buried her near the river they used to sit beside, the stones smooth from centuries of water. And though Carson was not a man given to tears, that day he didn't hide them. His daughter, born from another union, also died young, a second blade in a heart already scarred by wind and war. But still, Carson endured. He returned to the mountains, to the rivers, to the trail. Because grief, like hunger, was just another thing to survive. He grew quieter, not sadder, just deeper. Men noticed. They saw it in his eyes, in the way he stared too long at the horizon, or sat alone by the fire long after others slept. He wasn't chasing fortune or fame. He wasn't running from something. He was carrying it. And still the stories grew. Now they spoke of the man who faced down giants, who spoke with Comanche war chiefs, who could find a rabbit trail after 3 days of rain. They said he could go a week without sleep, that he once ran barefoot through a snowstorm to save a friend, that he never drew first, but never missed. Kit Carson's name was no longer a rumor. It was a legend, living and riding under the western sky. By the mid-1830s, in the hearts of trappers and traders, of scouts and soldiers, he had become something more than a man, a presence, a whisper in the trees, a flicker of movement across the ridge. The West knew him, and perhaps more importantly, it had accepted him. He had fought, he had loved, he had lost, and still he rode on. Because in the end, the wilderness didn't care about heroes or myths. It only respected one thing, those who could endure. And Kit Carson endured. The year was 1842, and the American frontier was no longer just a distant edge. It had become a national obsession. Maps ended in guesswork. Trails vanished into wilderness. The country, young and hungry, looked westward and whispered one phrase louder with each passing day: manifest destiny. It was into this rising storm of ambition that Kit Carson rode once more, this time not as a lone trapper, but as the right hand to a man who would soon become the face of American expansion. John C. Fremont. Fremont was young, brilliant, and driven by a fierce desire to explore, chart, and claim the continent. An officer in the Corps of Topographical Engineers and the son-in-law of powerful Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, he had ambition written into his blood. But ambition alone wasn't enough to survive the harsh bones of the Rocky Mountains or the deep canyons of the Sierra Nevada. For that, he needed someone who knew the land better than any map ever could. He needed Carson. Their meeting was chance, perhaps fate, a twist of trail in St. Louis. Carson, known now by reputation as a ghost of the West, was introduced to Fremont through a mutual friend. The army officer took one look at the quiet man in buckskins and said later, "Here was the very man I needed, modest, gentle but resolute, and fearless." Carson would become chief scout and guide on Fremont's expeditions, 3 long punishing journeys into the uncharted heart of the continent. And though Carson couldn't read or write, he could read the wind, the mountains, the migration of elk, the moods of rivers, the songs of ravens overhead. He could look at a ridge and tell you if it would break your horse's legs. He could smell rain a day before it came. He could hear danger in the crunch of pine needles 100 yards away. Together they carved their way across the Rockies, through the endless basin of Utah into Oregon, then across the jagged white teeth of the Sierra Nevada. Carson rode ahead of the columns, scouting paths through gorges that swallowed light. He navigated deserts where men hallucinated mirages. He kept them alive when their food ran out, when snow buried the tents, when wolves circled their fires in the night. And always, always, he led them true. When they reached the edge of California, still under Mexican rule, the expedition took on new purpose. Fremont, acting under shadowed orders, began stirring rebellion, plotting revolution, laying the groundwork for what would become the Bear Flag Revolt, and ultimately the U.S. annexation of California. Kit Carson was no politician. He didn't argue in rooms filled with maps and governors, but his actions, silent as they were, helped redraw the boundaries of a nation. With each mile mapped, each river crossed, each peak conquered, the United States grew. When they returned east, Fremont wrote glowing reports, published romantic memoirs of their journeys, and painted Carson as a titan, the man of the mountains, the pathfinder's guide, a hero born of the raw wilderness. The East, starved for icons, devoured every word. Carson didn't read a syllable, but he could feel the weight of his name growing heavier. And then came 1846. The wind shifted in the west, with whispers of war. The United States and Mexico stood on the brink of conflict, and in the shadow of this looming firestorm, tragedy struck. While encamped near the shores of Klamath Lake, in the rugged country of southern Oregon, Carson and Fremont's group were ambushed in the dark. The Klamath, a powerful and proud tribe, launched a swift and savage attack, catching the expedition by surprise. Arrows cut the night, and the screams of dying men broke the silence. Several of Carson's comrades were killed before they could draw breath. Blood soaked the pine needles. When the dust settled, the camp was shattered, and Kit Carson was staring at the body of a dead friend, his throat cut, his face unrecognizable. Something inside Carson, forged by years of survival, grief, and war, snapped. He approached the body of the Klamath chief who had died in the skirmish. With the cold precision of a man possessed, Carson drew his knife and disfigured the corpse, an act of vengeance meant not for the dead, but for the living. He wanted the Klamath to understand. This was personal. Within hours, Carson led a punitive strike on a nearby Klamath village. They rode in like thunder, weapons blazing. Warriors were cut down, homes were torched, blood spilled across the earth. It wasn't a battle. It was retribution. The attack left the village in ruins, the tribe shattered. Word of Carson's fury raced across the territory. Some called it justice, others called it savagery. But all agreed on one thing. Kit Carson was not a man to cross. To his allies, the action cemented him as a hero, a man who protected his own with unflinching loyalty. To his enemies he became a figure of terror, a spectre who could ride from the trees and leave fire in his wake. And yet, for all the violence, for all the blood, Carson was not a man who loved killing. He bore it like a burden, not a trophy. After the Klamath retaliation, those close to him described him as silent, withdrawn, staring into the fire as if searching for something that had been lost in the flames. Perhaps he saw singing grass again, or the face of his fallen friends, or perhaps he simply saw the truth, that in war even survival costs the soul. Still, the expeditions continued. Carson would ride with Fremont through California, across Nevada, into the tangled politics of rebellion and conquest. He would act as messenger, scout, and soldier. He would face down Mexican troops, deliver coded messages, and become the trusted blade of manifest destiny. But the duel with the Klamath, that moment in the woods where vengeance replaced reason, would forever haunt his legacy. In the myths told around campfires and carved into children's books, Carson would be remembered as the noble pathfinder, the mountain man with a heart of gold. But in the high valleys where blood had soaked the soil, a different story lingered, one of wrath, of trauma, of a man shaped by the violence of the world he helped tame. He was both things, hero and harbinger, guardian and executioner, and perhaps that is what made him endure. Because the West was never just a place, it was a crucible, and Carson, for better or worse, survived the fire. The Mexican-American War had become more than a clash of nations. It was a crucible of ambition, a proving ground for future legends, and a stage upon which the fate of a continent would be decided. At its ragged edges, where maps faded and survival became the only law, rode men like Kit Carson, men who didn't seek glory but found it all the same. By late 1846, Carson had already carved a place for himself in the story of westward expansion. But his most grueling trial, his most selfless act of courage, was yet to come. It happened in the hills and dry arroyos of Southern California, in the chaos of the Battle of San Pasqual, a desperate, blood-soaked clash that saw a small detachment of American soldiers pinned down, wounded and low on supplies, surrounded by determined Mexican forces. The Americans had underestimated the enemy, the terrain and the cruel economy of war. Commanded by General Stephen W. Kearny, the American troops, exhausted after a brutal march through the desert, were ambushed by Californio lancers near San Diego. Horses collapsed, men fell, and what was meant to be a swift occupation turned into a deadly stalemate. Among those with Kearny was Kit Carson, now officially a scout and courier for the U.S. military. He was no longer just a trapper or a guide. He was the thread tying together entire campaigns, a man whose decisions would determine who lived and who died. As the dust of battle settled over San Pasqual, the Americans dug in among the dry hills, wounded and trapped, miles from the reinforcements waiting in San Diego. Food was gone, water ran low. Every hour brought new danger, and every day meant another sunrise under siege. General Kearny turned to Carson. He needed someone to slip through the enemy lines, cross 30 miles of enemy-held territory, and reach Commodore Stockton's forces in San Diego. It was a suicide mission by any measure. The hills were crawling with lancers, the terrain was merciless, and the night air bit with cold. Anyone who left the perimeter faced death at the hands of scouts or starvation in the scrub. But Kit didn't hesitate. With Lieutenant Edward Beale, a young naval officer and a native guide known to history only by the fading echoes of his name, Carson slipped out under the veil of night, carrying nothing but a knife, a canteen, and the weight of every soul left behind. They removed their boots, not by choice, but by necessity. The sound of leather on rock could betray them in the stillness. Every crunch of sand or slip of gravel could be fatal, and so barefoot they vanished into the dark. The land gave no mercy. The trail cut across desert and canyon, fields of cholla cactus and volcanic rock, each step like fire. The trio moved in silence, avoiding patrols, skirting ravines, crawling at times on their bellies through thorn brush. The moon cast long shadows, and Carson, guided more by instinct than map, led them westward, ever westward, toward salvation. Their feet bled, skin tore, flesh shredded against hidden stone. Beale's hands were raw from dragging himself through brush. The native guide, toughened by a lifetime in the wild, led with eerie confidence through terrain Carson could barely read in the dark. But even he stumbled, even he bled. The sun rose and burned their backs. The desert came alive with heat and flies and the smell of death on the wind. Dehydrated, blistered, and sleep-deprived, the three men pressed on, driven not by orders, but by the thought of comrades dying just a few miles behind. By the second day, Carson's feet were flayed open. His steps left bloody prints on the sand. Beale passed out twice from exhaustion. The native guide had taken a cactus spine deep into his heel, but refused to slow down. They drank water from muddy hoofprints and moved only by night, hiding in brush when patrols passed. At one point, a Mexican scouting party passed within yards of their position. The three lay motionless, half covered in thornbush, barely breathing. Carson held his knife under his chin, ready to cut his own throat rather than be taken alive. They reached the outskirts of San Diego after nearly 30 hours of crawling, walking, and limping through hell. Carson staggered into the American outpost, face cracked with sunburn, feet swollen and torn beyond recognition. But he had made it. His message reached Commodore Stockton, who dispatched reinforcements with haste. The column turned east, and within hours Kearny's besieged force was rescued. The wounded were evacuated. The siege lifted. Dozens of lives were saved, all because three men had refused to die in the dark. The story of the barefoot march spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered it around campfires. Journalists in Washington retold it with breathless awe. But Carson never spoke of it. He said only that he did what needed doing, that the blood washed off, that he was no hero. But those who saw his feet, sliced to ribbons, wrapped in rags, oozing with infection, knew otherwise. Later, when Congress sought to award medals for valor, Carson's name was considered. But true to his character, he refused any special recognition, stating that others had done far more and spoken far less. To him, saving lives was not an act of bravery. It was simply his duty, yet no one forgot. The barefoot march to San Diego became a symbol of frontier grit, of American resolve at its most desperate hour. Carson, the silent scout, the man who had never sought the spotlight, now stood at the center of a national mythos. To the men of the West, he was no longer just a mountain man. He was the spine of the frontier, the knife edge between survival and oblivion, and the trail ahead, stained with blood and legend, was still far from over. The hills of California in December 1846 were painted in dust and blood. Winter's cold breath had swept across the mesas, but in the valleys the sun still burned, as did the tension between two worlds colliding. The United States, fueled by manifest destiny, had come west with maps and muskets. California, once a distant province of Mexico, had become a prize coveted by generals and politicians alike. At the center of this violent collision stood General Stephen W. Kearny, leading a detachment of dragoons to join with Commodore Stockton in San Diego. But Kearny had misjudged both terrain and enemy, and perhaps worst of all, the will of the Californios. Led by the skilled Andres Pico, the Californio Lancers were not ragged rebels, but seasoned fighters on horseback, raised on the very land they now defended. They knew every arroyo, every rise, every blind turn, and they waited patiently. The ambush came in the early light near San Pascual. Kearny's men were exhausted from a desert march and soaked from a cold rain that had drenched their powder and sapped their strength. The American force charged into the open with dulled sabers and sluggish horses, only to meet a storm of lances and fury. The battlefield turned chaotic. American troops were cut down with precision, horses screamed, men fell, and the line crumbled. In the melee, one after another, the soldiers fell. Dragoons were pulled from their saddles, stabbed in the chest, left bleeding in the dust. The Californios fought like warriors defending sacred soil, and they were winning. Carson was there at the edge of it all. He was no general, no officer of rank, but as always, he had ridden ahead of the wind, a scout and shadow. He fought with a rifle in one hand and a knife in the other, and when he saw the line faltering, when he saw Kearny wounded and the dragoons pushed back toward Mule Hill, it was Carson who understood what had to be done. They were surrounded. Night fell on the battered survivors, huddled atop a rocky rise low on ammunition, their wounded groaning in the dust. Rain soaked their blankets. The howls of coyotes mingled with the cries of the dying. Mule Hill became a tomb waiting to be sealed, unless help arrived. And help would not come unless someone could break through enemy lines, cross miles of hostile territory, and reach Stockton's forces. It was again a death sentence of a mission. Carson volunteered without hesitation. Along with Lieutenant Beale and a native guide, he crawled barefoot through thorns and cacti, slicing his feet open to keep silence. His journey, now legend, ended in San Diego, where reinforcements were summoned. When those reinforcements arrived at Mule Hill, they found a force half-starved and barely breathing. But they were alive, because Kit Carson had walked through hell to bring them back. The story of San Pascual spread faster than wildfire. It was published in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. Headlines read, "Scout Saves Doomed Regiment," "Carson the Silent Hero," "Barefoot Messenger of the West." He did not bask in it. He did not give interviews. He didn't know how to write his own name, let alone pen a memoir. But everywhere he went, soldiers tipped their hats. Civilians whispered his name. His reputation, once that of a fierce mountain man, became something greater, a legend of loyalty, of sacrifice, and of courage without vanity. And yet, in the dust and glory of San Pascual, the full truth of Kit Carson remained complex, because what the public saw was not always the full man. Chapter 8. Carson's Loyalty and the Killing of Civilians. If war builds legends, it also breaks illusions. In 1846, following the San Pascual campaign, Carson remained embedded in military operations throughout California. Serving under John C. Fremont, his old partner from the exploratory days, Carson was now fully part of the American effort to seize the Pacific. He was respected by soldiers and feared by enemies. His judgment was trusted absolutely, and that trust at times placed him at the edge of moral collapse. The incident occurred in early 1847, as American forces pushed deeper into Mexican territory, enforcing their claim by sword and treaty. After a skirmish near San Luis Obispo, a grim order was given. 3 unarmed Californio civilians, suspected of having aided enemy forces, were captured. Among them were 2 young brothers, barely into adulthood, and an elderly man in his 70s. They were not armed combatants, nor did they resist arrest. But Fremont, convinced of their guilt and eager to assert authority, ordered their execution without trial, a chilling message meant to quash resistance through fear. The army had grown weary. Discipline was fraying. The law of the frontier was fast becoming the law of expedience, and it fell to Kit Carson to carry out the order. There is no record of protest, no hesitation preserved in letters, no testimony that Carson resisted. He took the men, shackled and silent, to a clearing just outside camp. Witnesses say the sky was cloudless, the breeze mild. The brothers prayed quietly, the old man trembling. Carson stood at a distance. Then he gave the signal. Shots rang out. 3 bodies fell. 3 lives ended not in battle, but in cold military justice, delivered by a man who had once been a symbol of frontier honor. The killings were never prosecuted. Fremont's political clout protected him, and Carson's reputation remained mostly unscathed, at least in the newspapers. But among those who served and among the Californio families who mourned, the act echoed. Years later, when asked about the incident, Carson gave only a flat answer: "I followed orders." This moment, more than any other, exposed the paradox at Carson's core. Here was a man who lived by a code, a man who rescued the wounded, who walked barefoot through cactus to save lives, who treated native tribes with a respect few white men ever offered. And yet, he also obeyed without question, even when the command shattered that code. In war, men carry more than weapons. They carry contradictions. Carson's loyalty was unquestionable, but that same loyalty, blind and rigid, sometimes made him an instrument of cruelty. Before continuing, please subscribe to the video and leave a like to continue watching stories of great men from the Old West. This stain on his legacy would not fade. It would re-emerge in later years, most tragically during the Navajo campaign, where his obedience would again collide with morality. But at San Luis Obispo, in that quiet field stained with blood, the myth cracked. The man who had once only drawn his gun in defense now pulled the trigger for authority, not justice, and the West, ever-changing, moved on. Carson rode ahead again, carrying the weight of his choices like another scar. He said little, he always said little. But the silence now was different, not stoic, but solemn. In the summer of 1846, the sun rose over a California still claimed by Mexico, but increasingly haunted by the shadow of another flag. A flag not yet planted, but already whispered about in backrooms army camps and among settlers. The Americans had come, and with them came a tide that would not recede. At the heart of that tide stood John C. Fremont, the bold, ambitious explorer-turned-military commander. And at his side, always his shadow, always his blade, was Kit Carson. They had crossed rivers together, scaled mountains that no map acknowledged, and now they stood on the edge of an empire. California, wild, sunburned, fertile, was not merely land. It was a promise. Manifest destiny had reached the Pacific, and these 2 men were the instruments of its fulfillment. But conquest rarely begins with cannon fire. It begins with rumor, with symbols, with the raising of a flag. In Sonoma, a sleepy outpost of Mexican California, a group of American settlers, farmers, traders, and adventurers emboldened by Fremont's presence, declared their independence. They arrested the Mexican military commander, General Mariano Vallejo, and hoisted a crude banner. A grizzly bear on a white field, paws outstretched, stars overhead, the bear flag. It was amateurish, almost childlike, but behind it lay a declaration that was anything but innocent. California would no longer be Mexican. Fremont, though not yet officially ordered to take control of the region, did not hesitate. He recognized that the window of opportunity was open, and with Carson at his side he leapt through it. Carson, now no longer just a scout, became an enforcer, the quiet hand of Fremont's authority. He moved through the settlements, delivering messages, issuing commands, and securing supply routes. When diplomacy failed, Carson brought the threat of violence with terrifying credibility. His name alone carried weight. He had already killed for the cause. He would do so again. Sonoma became the capital of the short-lived California Republic, and Fremont, a man not elected nor commissioned for such a role, assumed dictatorial control. His word was law. He arrested those who questioned it. He armed his men with Carson and the militia at their backs. And when American naval forces finally arrived on the coast, when the Stars and Stripes were officially raised above Monterey and San Francisco, it seemed like an inevitability, not an invasion. The Bear Flag Republic vanished as quickly as it appeared, folded into the broader push of the United States conquest of California. But the myth remained, and in that myth, Carson became both hero and hammer. The campaign that followed was not bloodless. Mexican resistance was fierce in places like Los Angeles, San Gabriel, and San Fernando, where California fighters rallied under Andres Pico and others. Guerrilla warfare erupted, horses were stolen, American outposts were attacked. In the chaos, Carson led patrols and raids, hunting resistance leaders and breaking supply lines. His tactics were swift and brutal. Villages were seized before dawn, wagons were burned. Any man suspected of aiding the Mexican cause was arrested, or worse. Justice on the frontier was fast, often without trial, and Kit Carson, the man of quiet words and quick hands, did not flinch in the face of necessity. To Fremont, Carson was indispensable. To many Californios, he was a ghost of death in buckskins. But the campaign worked. By the end of 1846, American dominance in California was no longer a question of if, but how long. The U.S. Navy controlled the coast. Fremont controlled the north. Kearny, newly arrived with army reinforcements, claimed the south. Still, a collision loomed, not between nations, but between commanders. Fremont, flush with his victories and basking in the glow of his self-appointed role, refused to cede command to General Kearny, who had orders from Washington and the backing of President Polk. It was a dangerous standoff, teetering on the edge of civil conflict. Carson, ever the loyal man, stood beside Fremont. But even he saw the writing on the wall. The war with Mexico was shifting to other fronts. California was no longer a battleground. It was a spoil of war. And Washington did not care for rogue generals or unsanctioned republics. Fremont was eventually relieved of his command and would later face court-martial. Carson, too, was called to Washington to testify, though he emerged from the affair untouched by scandal. His loyalty was noted, but his role was forgiven, perhaps because men like Carson were too valuable to alienate, or perhaps because his silence once again protected him. The conquest of California was complete. But the cost had been more than land and blood. It had forged legends and bruised reputations. It had transformed farmers into rebels, rebels into politicians, and scouts into executioners. Kit Carson was no longer just a mountain man, he was now an American icon, carved into the very bedrock of a growing empire. He had stood by Fremont during the Bear Flag Revolt. He had helped erase a border that had stood for centuries. And now, as California flew the American flag from its missions forts and gold-laden rivers, Carson rode onward, a witness to history, a participant in conquest, and a man whose soul bore the weight of every victory won by violence. In the vast theater of the American West, where the wind carries the memory of both triumph and tragedy, one name echoes louder than most: Kit Carson. A man born of the frontier and molded by its savage contradictions, Carson's legacy is carved not only into mountains and rivers, but into the very mythos of the United States, relentless expansion. He was not a mere figure of his time. He was a symbol of it, a flesh-and-blood embodiment of a nation surging westward, driven by ambition, faith, violence, and destiny. After decades of guiding expeditions through uncharted wilderness, facing down enemies from every side, And watching as American flags were planted in the soil of fallen republics, Carson's story did not end with gunpowder and glory. It transformed. He went from scout to soldier, from killer to diplomat, and, most paradoxically, from an agent of war to a negotiator of peace. In the 1850s, Carson accepted a post as an Indian agent, an intermediary between the U.S. government and native tribes. It was a role steeped in paradox. Few white men had lived among native peoples as Carson had. Few had married into their families, spoken their languages, and sat beside their fires. Yet it was also Carson who had led missions that displaced them, who had burned villages under military orders, who had personally escorted some tribes to reservations they never wished to see. As an agent, he often advocated for fair treatment, pleading with Washington to fulfill treaty promises and provide food, supplies, and medical aid. He saw firsthand the starvation, the suffering, the betrayals. He argued, he wrote letters, he stood on Capitol steps and begged for action, and he was mostly ignored. Carson, once the sharp knife of westward conquest, now found himself a frustrated caretaker of its moral aftermath. But the public didn't see that struggle. What they saw or thought they saw was a legend. In the pages of dime novels, Carson became larger than life. He was no longer a man. He was an archetype, a fearless Indian fighter, a scout with supernatural skill, a killer of outlaws, protector of wagon trains, friend to presidents. Writers painted him as a lone hero riding into danger, pistols blazing, saving settlers from impossible odds. These stories bore little resemblance to reality. Carson himself could barely read them, and often scoffed at their wild exaggerations. Yet the myths endured, and still do. Statues rose in his honor. Counties, towns, rivers, and even military forts bore his name. Schoolchildren learned of his bravery, not his contradictions. Politicians cited him as a model of American ruggedness. The nation, in its effort to enshrine its own expansion, chose Carson as a mascot for manifest destiny. And yet for every monument, there remained another story, one told in the oral histories of native nations, where Kit Carson was not a hero, but a villain. Among the Navajo, for example, Carson is remembered not for the trails he opened, but for the scorched earth campaign he waged during the brutal Long Walk, a campaign that uprooted thousands, burned homes and crops, and forced a people to march across deserts into exile. Though Carson's orders came from above, the pain his actions inflicted endures in cultural memory. To many he is not a legend but a symbol of betrayal and destruction. This is the legacy of Kit Carson, not simple, not singular, but deeply conflicted. He was a man of loyalty and lethality, of tenderness and terror. He mourned his native wife, yet helped force her people from their lands. He risked his life for comrades and missions alike, yet carried out orders that haunt the annals of history. As the West changed, so did he. He would go on to serve in the Civil War, briefly commanding the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Infantry, defending forts and supply lines from Confederate and Apache raids. Even in his final years, the fire of the frontier never left him. His body weakened, but his eyes still scanned horizons as if expecting new trails to blaze. If you've watched this far, please subscribe to our channel, and leave a like on the video, and of course, you'll probably like this story on the screen too.